"You're not blood. You'll never be real family." Those were the last words Marcus spoke before he slammed the mahogany door of the estate in Sophia's face. 22 years old, standing in the rain with nothing but a suitcase and her mother's wedding ring, she had no idea that 3 months later, she'd be sitting in a lawyer's office learning that her biological father had left her everything, the same father Marcus claimed never existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 7 times as Sophia descended the spiral staircase, her footsteps muffled by the Persian runner that had probably cost more than most people's cars. She paused at the bottom, adjusting the simple black dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral 3 days earlier, the same dress that had earned her a disapproving look from Marcus when she'd refused to change into something more appropriate for the family image. The dining room stretched before her like a museum exhibit, all gleaming surfaces and inherited artifacts that spoke of old money and older grudges. Crystal goblets caught the light from the chandelier, casting tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. She'd set this table countless times over the past 8 years, ever since her mother married Marcus Pemberton and moved them into Willowbrook Manor. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the weight of recent loss hung in the air like incense. Marcus sat at the head of the table, silver hair perfectly styled, reading financial reports through wire-rimmed glasses. At 48, he carried himself with the practiced authority of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His son Trevor, 25 and already showing signs of his father's entitled bearing, scrolled through his phone while picking at his salad with obvious boredom. Sophia took her usual seat halfway down the table, the one her mother had designated as hers when they'd first moved in. Not too close to seem presumptuous, not too far to appear antisocial. The perfect distance for someone who existed in the space between family and stranger. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, emerged from the kitchen carrying a silver platter of herb-crusted salmon. She'd been with the Pemberton family for 15 years and had watched Sophia grow from an awkward 14-year-old into the young woman who now sat quietly observing the dynamics that had shaped her adolescence. Mrs. Chen's eyes held a warmth that the rest of the house seemed to lack, especially now that Catherine Pemberton was no longer there to bridge the gap between her daughter and her new family. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," Sophia said softly as the older woman placed a portion on her plate. The simple courtesy seemed to irritate Marcus, who looked up from his papers with the expression of someone who'd been interrupted during important work. "We need to discuss the arrangements," Marcus announced without preamble, setting aside his documents. "The memorial service went well, but there are practical matters to address now." Treader glanced up from his phone long enough to smirk. "Finally, I was wondering when we'd get to the good stuff." Sophia's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What arrangements?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, assuming the posture he used during board meetings when he was about to deliver news that someone wouldn't like. "Your mother's affairs have been settled. The lawyers have been quite thorough. What remains is determining your future living situation." The salmon suddenly tasted like cardboard in Sophia's mouth. She forced herself to swallow before speaking. "My living situation? I live here. This has been my home for 8 years. "This has been your mother's home," Marcus corrected, with the patience of someone explaining simple mathematics to a child. "Catherine was family. You, despite what your mother may have told you about your place here, are not." The words landed like physical blows. Sophia had always known her position in the Pemberton household was precarious, dependent entirely on her mother's presence. But hearing it stated so baldly, with Trevor nodding agreement through a mouthful of salmon, felt like being erased in real time. "I see," she managed, though she didn't see at all. Her mind raced through possibilities, trying to calculate how long her savings might last, whether any of her college friends might have a spare room, how she would finish her senior year at Northwestern when the tuition money had always come from Marcus. "I've spoken with the headmaster at Clearwater Academy," Marcus continued, cutting his fish with surgical precision. "They're willing to offer you a position in their administrative office. It's entry-level, but it includes housing in the staff quarters. You'd be able to support yourself modestly." "Clearwater Academy is in Vermont," Sophia said slowly. "That's 14 hours away." Yes, well, sometimes fresh starts require distance. Marcus took a sip of wine, as if they were discussing vacation destinations rather than her exile from the only stable home she'd known. Trevor finally looked up from his phone, grinning with the malicious enjoyment of someone watching a rival's downfall. Think of it as character building, Soph. You always did like those independence speeches in your debate class. The nickname stung. Trevor had used it mockingly throughout their forced siblinghood, especially when he wanted to remind her that she was the outsider looking in. Now it carried the additional weight of goodbye. "What about my things?" Sophia asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "My mother's things?" Marcus exchanged a glance with Trevor that lasted a fraction too long. "Your personal belongings will be packed and shipped to Vermont, naturally. As for your mother's possessions, those remain part of the estate." Including her jewelry, the pieces she specifically said would be mine? "There's no formal documentation of such promises," Marcus replied smoothly. "Everything will be handled according to legal requirements." Sophia stared at him across the expanse of mahogany and crystal, understanding finally crystallizing like ice forming over a pond. This wasn't a conversation about her future. This was a polite eviction notice dressed up as concern for her welfare. "When?" she asked. "The position starts Monday. I've taken the liberty of purchasing your ticket. You'll leave Saturday morning." 4 days. She had 4 days to disappear from a life that had never quite been hers anyway. Mrs. Chen reappeared to refill water glasses, and Sophia caught the older woman's eye. The housekeeper's expression was carefully neutral, but there was something there. Sympathy, perhaps? Or anger on Sophia's behalf? It was more acknowledgement of the situation's cruelty than she was getting from anyone else at the table. "I'd like to visit my mother's grave before I leave," Sophia said, testing whether she had any agency left in this conversation. "Of course," Marcus agreed, with magnanimous ease. "Grief is important to process properly." The rest of dinner passed in stilted conversation about Trevor's upcoming graduate program and Marcus's plans for expanding his consulting firm. Sophia ate mechanically, her mind already racing ahead to the practical realities of starting over. She had some money saved from her part-time job at the university library, but not enough to live on for long. Her car was reliable, but old. Her clothes were mostly hand-me-downs from her mother or clearance rack finds that would need to last. When Mrs. Chen brought out dessert, chocolate tart with raspberry coulis, Sophia declined and excused herself. Marcus nodded dismissively, already returning his attention to Trevor's description of his thesis project on emerging markets in Southeast Asia. Upstairs in her room, the room that had been hers for 8 years, but apparently never really belonged to her, Sophia sat on the edge of her bed and tried to process what had just happened. The space felt different now, temporary in a way it had never felt before. The posters on the walls, the books on the shelves, the collection of snow globes her mother had started buying her from every business trip suddenly seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, trying to think of someone to call. Her college friends were all dealing with their own post-graduation anxieties. Her high school friends had scattered to different states and different lives. The few extended family members on her mother's side lived across the country and had never been particularly close. The isolation wasn't new, but its completeness felt suffocating tonight. A soft knock on her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Chen with some practical advice about packing. Instead, Trevor pushed open the door and leaned against a frame with casual ownership of the space she was about to lose. "So, Vermont, huh? That's pretty harsh, even for Dad." "Did you come here to gloat?" "Actually, no." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, lowering his voice. "I came to give you some advice." Sophia raised an eyebrow. In 8 years of cohabitation, Trevor had never offered her anything resembling kindness. Their relationship had been politely antagonistic at best, with him making it clear through 1,000 small cruelties that she was a temporary inconvenience in his family's life. "Don't take the job," he said. "Excuse me." Trevor sat down in her desk chair, spinning it slightly as he spoke. "The Clearwater thing, it's not what he told you. I heard him on the phone with the headmaster. It's not administrative work, it's custodial. Night shift cleaning, basically. And the staff housing? It's a converted storage room in the basement." The revelation shouldn't have surprised her, but somehow it did. Even now, even in the midst of throwing her out, Marcus couldn't resist one final humiliation. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Trevor shrugged, looking younger than his 25 years for the first time in recent memory. "Because watching him screw you over is making me realize some things about what kind of person I want to be. And," he paused, seeming to wrestle with something, "your mom was actually pretty decent to me. She didn't have to be, but she was." It was the closest thing to kindness anyone had shown her since the funeral, and it came from the last person she'd expected. Sophia felt tears threatening for the first time since sitting in that lawyer's office listening to her mother's will being read. "So what am I supposed to do? I can't stay here." "No, you definitely can't stay here. Dad's already converting your room into a home gym." Trevor's casual delivery of this information hit harder than anything Marcus had said at dinner. "But you've got options. You're smart, you've got a degree. Don't let him railroad you into the first shitty situation he finds." After Trevor left, Sophia sat in the darkness of her soon-to-be former room and tried to think of alternatives. She could use her savings to rent a small apartment somewhere cheap while she looked for real work. She could move back to Chicago, where she'd gone to college, and try to find something in her field of art history. She could accept that she was about to become one of those post-graduation statistics living paycheck to paycheck while trying to figure out what came next. But first, she needed to understand exactly what her mother had left behind. Marcus had been deliberately vague about the estate details, which seemed suspicious given his usual preference for overwhelming people with unnecessary specifics. The next morning, while Marcus was at his office and Trevor was sleeping off what smelled like a significant quantity of whiskey, Sophia made her way to her mother's study. The room had been Catherine's sanctuary, filled with her books on interior design and gardening, her collection of vintage postcards, and the small desk where she'd managed the household accounts and written thank you notes in her careful script. The desk doors were locked, but Sophia knew where her mother had kept the key. Hidden behind a loose piece of molding near the window, the same place she'd hidden treats when Sophia was young and Marcus was on one of his health food campaigns. Inside the bottom drawer, beneath folders of warranty information and old Christmas cards, Sophia found a manila envelope with her name written across the front in her mother's handwriting. Inside were copies of legal documents, including her mother's will and something else that made Sophia's hands shake as she read it. A letter, dated just 2 weeks before Catherine's death, addressed to a law firm in Seattle. In it, Catherine detailed her desire to locate someone named David Morrison, who she believed might be Sophia's biological father. She'd hired a private investigator and included a copy of his preliminary report, which confirmed that David Morrison was indeed living in Seattle, where he'd built a successful architectural firm after leaving Millbrook 23 years earlier. The timeline matched perfectly with what Sophia had always known about her origins. Her mother had been 22, fresh out of college, working as a secretary at a construction company when she'd had a brief relationship with a young architect. He'd left town for a job opportunity before Catherine realized she was pregnant, and she'd never been able to track him down to tell him about Sophia, or so she'd always claimed. But according to the private investigator's report, David Morrison hadn't just left Millbrook. He'd left because Catherine's parents, who disapproved of their daughter dating someone they considered beneath their social station, had paid him to disappear. The report included copies of bank records showing a payment of $50,000, along with a letter from Catherine's father threatening legal action if David ever attempted to contact their daughter again. Sophia stared at the documents until the words blurred together. Her mother had never known why David left. She'd believed he'd abandoned them both, when in reality, he'd been bought off by grandparents who died when Sophia was 12, taking their secrets with them. The investigator's report included David's current address, his business information, and one more piece of information that made Sophia's chest tighten with something between hope and terror. 6 months earlier, David Morrison had updated his will to include provisions for any biological children he might have fathered, specifically mentioning a daughter, who he believed might exist but had never been able to locate. He had been looking for her too. Sophia photographed every page with her phone, then carefully returned the documents to their hiding place. She needed time to process this information, to decide what it meant and what she wanted to do about it. But for the first time since sitting in that dining room, being told she had no place in the family she'd known for 8 years, she felt like she might have options beyond accepting whatever Marcus chose to give her. That afternoon, she drove to Millbrook Cemetery to visit her mother's grave as she'd promised. The headstone was simple granite with Catherine's name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Wife and Mother." No mention of her life before Marcus, no acknowledgement of the 22 years she'd spent as a single mother building a life for herself and her daughter. Sophia knelt beside the grave and traced her mother's name with her fingertip. "I found your letter," she whispered. "I found out about Dad, about what really happened." The wind rustled through the oak trees that surrounded the cemetery, carrying the scent of spring rain and new grass. Sophia closed her eyes and tried to imagine what her mother would want her to do with this information. Catherine had always been cautious, protective, unwilling to rock boats that might capsize and leave them both struggling in the water. But Catherine was gone now, and Sophia was already drowning anyway. She pulled out her phone and looked up the website for Morrison Architecture. David's photo showed a man in his late 40s with graying hair and kind eyes that looked remarkably like her own. The firm specialized in sustainable housing and community development projects with an emphasis on creating affordable options for young families. It was the kind of work that suggested someone who cared about building things that mattered. Standing in the cemetery where her mother lay buried, Sophia made a decision that would have terrified her just a week earlier. She wasn't going to Vermont. She wasn't going to accept the role of grateful charity case in Marcus's narrative about proper family boundaries. She was going to Seattle to find her father. That evening at dinner, she waited until dessert to make her announcement. Marcus was discussing his latest golf game with Trevor when Sophia cleared her throat. "I've decided not to accept the position in Vermont," she said calmly. Marcus looked up from his crème brûlée with the expression of someone who'd been told the laws of physics had been suspended. "Excuse me? I appreciate the opportunity, but I've decided to pursue other options." "What other options?" Trevor asked, and Sophia caught something in his voice that might have been admiration. "I have some leads on positions that are more aligned with my career goals," she said, which was technically true if you considered finding your biological father a career goal. Marcus set down his spoon with deliberate precision. "I see. And where exactly do you plan to live while pursuing these mysterious opportunities?" "I have arrangements." "With whom?" Sophia met his gaze steadily. "Does it matter? You've made it clear that my living situation is no longer your concern." The silence that followed was thick with Marcus's frustration at having his authority questioned. He was accustomed to people accepting his decisions with gratitude, not presenting alternatives he hadn't approved. "I think you're making a mistake," he said finally. "The working world is not kind to young women without family support or practical experience." "Then I guess I'll learn quickly." Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Sophia wondered if he could see the change in her. The way grief and anger had crystallized into something harder than the malleable politeness he was used to from her. "Very well," he said, with the tone of someone washing their hands of a problematic situation. "I trust you understand that this decision means our obligations to you end on Saturday as planned." "I understand." "Including financial obligations." "I understand." "And you cannot expect to return here if these arrangements don't work out." Sophia nodded, feeling lighter with each bridge Marcus burned behind her. "I wouldn't dream of it." The next 3 days passed in a blur of packing and planning. Sophia sorted through her belongings with ruthless efficiency, taking only what she could fit in her car and what held genuine sentimental value. Most of her furniture would stay behind anyway, and she found herself surprisingly unburdened by the prospect of starting over with less. Mrs. Chen appeared in her doorway Friday evening as she was folding the last of her clothes into boxes. The older woman held a brown paper bag and wore the expression of someone about to commit a minor crime. "Your mother asked me to give this to you when you moved out," Mrs. Chen said quietly, glancing toward the hallway as if Marcus might materialize to stop her. Inside the bag was her mother's jewelry box, the small wooden one with the ballerina that had fascinated Sophia as a child. Underneath it was an envelope with her name on it. "She knew?" Sophia asked. Mrs. Chen nodded sadly. "She knew he would not let you stay. She made me promise to wait until you were really leaving, not just going to college. The letter inside was brief but devastating in its clarity. Catherine had always known that Marcus would never accept Sophia as true family, but she'd hoped her presence might soften his edges over time. She'd been wrong, and she was sorry for the years Sophia had spent trying to earn approval that was never going to come. But she wasn't sorry for the marriage, because it had given them both financial security and social stability that Catherine couldn't have provided alone. She'd made the best choice she could with the information she had, and she hoped someday Sophia would understand. The letter ended with an address in Seattle and a simple message: "In case you ever want to know where you came from." Sophia sat on her bed holding the letter until well past midnight, thinking about the woman who'd raised her and the choices that had shaped both their lives. Catherine had been protecting her in the only way she knew how, even when that protection meant keeping secrets that might have changed everything. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, fitting weather for an ending that had been 8 years in the making. Sophia loaded her car while Marcus made a show of reading the newspaper in the breakfast room, demonstrating his indifference to her departure. Trevor helped carry boxes without being asked, which surprised her until she realized he was probably eager to see her gone for his own reasons. As she secured the last box in her back seat, Mrs. Chen appeared with a thermos of coffee and a packet of sandwiches for the road. "Drive carefully," she said, squeezing Sophia's hand, "and call when you get there, wherever there is." Sophia promised she would, then climbed into her car and started the engine. As she pulled out of the circular driveway, she caught a glimpse of Marcus in the breakfast room window. He raised his coffee cup in what might have been a farewell salute or a gesture of good riddance. Either way, she didn't look back. The drive to Seattle would take her 3 days if she pushed hard, longer if she took her time. She had enough money saved for gas, cheap motels, and fast food, with a little left over for job hunting once she arrived. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was hers. Somewhere outside of Chicago, with the morning sun breaking through the clouds and 8 hours of highway stretching ahead, Sophia finally allowed herself to cry. Not the careful, quiet tears she'd perfected during her years at Willowbrook Manor, but the ugly, cathartic sobs of someone who'd been holding her breath for almost a decade. When the crying stopped, she felt hollow but clean, like a house that had been cleared of all its furniture and was ready for new occupants. She turned up the radio, rolled down the windows, and drove west toward a father who might not even know her name yet. Behind her, everything she'd known grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. Ahead lay a city she'd never seen and a man she'd never met, connected to her by nothing more than DNA and the hope that blood might sometimes be thicker than the legal documents that had defined her life so far. The highway stretched out like a promise, and for the first time in years, Sophia felt like she was driving towards something instead of away from it. 3 days later, she would stand in the lobby of Morrison Architecture, trying to find the courage to ask the receptionist if she could speak to David Morrison about a personal matter. She would discover that having a plan and executing it were two very different things, and that showing up unannounced to tell someone they might be your father was significantly more complicated than it seemed from a distance. But that was still ahead of her. For now, there was only the road and the possibility that somewhere at the end of it, someone might be glad to see her coming. The radio played a song she didn't recognize, something about second chances and new beginnings, and Sophia sang along despite not knowing the words. It felt like practice for a life where she wouldn't have to apologize for taking up space or ask permission to exist in rooms that were supposed to be hers. Miles rolled by under her wheels, each one carrying her farther from the girl who'd spent 8 years trying to earn her place at a table that was never meant for her. She didn't know yet who she would become in Seattle, but she knew she was done being the person Marcus Pemberton thought she was. That was enough to start with. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning clouds, and the highway signs began promising cities she'd only seen on maps. Sophia pressed a little harder on the accelerator and drove toward the future, whatever it might hold. Seattle's skyline emerged through the morning mist like something from a postcard, all gleaming towers and green hills rising from the water. Sophia had never seen mountains before, not real ones, and the sight of the Cascades looming in the distance made her feel simultaneously insignificant and exhilarated. After 3 days of flat highways and truck stop coffee,
the city felt like stepping into someone else's dream. She'd spent the previous night in a budget motel in Spokane, lying awake rehearsing conversations that might never happen. How do you introduce yourself to a father who doesn't know you exist? How do you explain that you've driven 2,000 miles based on documents hidden in a desk drawer and the desperate hope that DNA might translate into belonging? The GPS guided her through downtown traffic, toward the address she'd memorized, past coffee shops that looked like they belonged in magazines, and bookstores with hand-painted signs advertising poetry readings.
Everything felt purposefully crafted, as if the city had been designed by people who understood that aesthetics mattered as much as function. Morrison Architecture occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse in the Capitol Hill district. The building's exterior had been restored to showcase its original brick and timber construction, with large windows that flooded the interior spaces with natural light. Sophia parked across the street and sat in her car for 20 minutes, watching people come and go through the glass doors of the lobby. A woman about her own age emerged, carrying rolled architectural plans and a travel mug with a logo she didn't recognize. An older man in paint-splattered jeans followed, talking animatedly on his phone about sustainable materials and construction timelines. These people looked like they belonged to something, like they were part of a community that valued their contributions. Finally, when the morning coffee rush had settled and her courage felt as ready as it was likely to get, Sophia crossed the street and pushed through the lobby doors. The interior smelled like fresh lumber and coffee, with exposed beams overhead and polished concrete floors that somehow managed to feel warm rather than industrial. The reception area featured a gallery wall of photographs showing completed projects, affordable housing developments with solar panels and community gardens, a homeless shelter designed to look like apartments rather than an institution, a community center built around a central courtyard where children could play while their parents attended classes or meetings. "Can I help you?" The receptionist was a woman in her 30s with short gray hair and kind eyes behind rectangular glasses. Her desk was organized chaos, covered with project files and a small succulent garden that suggested someone who stayed late enough to need living things around. Sophia's carefully rehearsed introduction evaporated. "I'm looking for David Morrison. I don't have an appointment. Is this regarding a project inquiry?" "It's personal." The words felt inadequate, but she couldn't think of how else to categorize showing up unannounced to meet your biological father. The receptionist studied her with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned to distinguish between legitimate visitors and people who might waste her boss's time. Whatever she saw in Sophia's face must have passed the test because she picked up her phone. "David, there's someone here to see you about a personal matter." "No, she doesn't have an appointment." A pause while she listened. "Okay, I'll send her back." The receptionist hung up and smiled. "Conference room B, straight down the hall. He'll be with you in just a moment." The conference room walls were covered with more project photos and architectural sketches, some framed professionally and others tacked up with pushpins as if they were still being refined. A scale model of what looked like a mixed-use development sat in the center of a long table, complete with tiny trees and miniature people walking along sidewalks. Sophia was studying the model when the door opened behind her. She turned and found herself face to face with a man who shared her eyes, her nose, and the same habit of tilting his head slightly when concentrating. The photographs on his website hadn't prepared her for the shock of recognition, the way her own features looked back at her from someone else's face. David Morrison stood in the doorway holding a coffee mug and wearing the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with insufficient information. He was taller than she'd expected, with the kind of presence that suggested confidence without arrogance. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms marked with small scars that spoke of someone who still worked with his hands despite running a successful business. "I'm David," he said simply, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "I'm sorry, but Rachel didn't catch your name." "Sophia." Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "Sophia Bennett." The name clearly didn't mean anything to him, which shouldn't have been surprising, but somehow still stung. She'd been carrying his absence her entire life, but to him, she was just another stranger interrupting his Tuesday morning. "What can I do for you, Sophia?" She'd imagined this moment countless times during the drive west, but none of her mental rehearsals had prepared her for the reality of standing in a room with someone who might be her father while he waited politely for her to explain herself.
The words she'd practiced felt theatrical and inadequate. "I think," she began, then stopped and tried again. "I believe you might be my father." David's coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully on the conference table and studied her face with new attention, as if seeing her for the first time. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "My mother was Catherine Taylor. She worked at Brennan Construction in Millbrook about 23 years ago. You were an architect there, working on a residential development project." The change in David's expression was immediate and dramatic. Color drained from his face, as if someone had adjusted the lighting in the room. He sank into one of the conference room chairs, never taking his eyes off her. "Catherine," he whispered. "Catherine with the red hair and the laugh that could light up a room?" Sophia nodded, feeling tears gretten at the way he said her mother's name, like it was something precious he'd been holding carefully for decades. "She said you left for a job opportunity in Portland. She never knew why you didn't say goodbye." David's hands gripped the edge of the table. "I didn't leave for a job. I left because her father paid me to disappear." The words hung in the air between them, confirming what Sophia had read in the private investigator's report, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that documents couldn't. "He came to my apartment one night with two men who looked like they knew how to break things that didn't cooperate. He had a check and a contract that said if I ever contacted Catherine again, if I ever came back to Millbrook, he'd have me arrested for harassment and make sure I never worked as an architect anywhere." David stood and walked to the window, staring out at the Seattle skyline, as if it might provide answers to questions he'd been carrying for 23 years. "I was 24 years old, fresh out of graduate school, drowning in student loans. $50,000 felt like winning the lottery. But more than that, he convinced me that Catherine deserved better than someone who couldn't even afford to take her to dinner somewhere with tablecloths." "She never knew," Sophia said quietly. "She thought you'd left because you didn't want the responsibility." God. David turned back to her, and she could see tears in his eyes that matched her own. "All these years, I thought she knew. I thought she'd agreed to it. She hired a private investigator to find you, right before she died. That's how I learned the truth." "She's gone?" Sophia nodded, not trusting her voice to explain about the cancer, the quick decline, the funeral where Marcus had made it clear that her mourning period had an expiration date. David returned to his seat across from her, and they sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the revelation that 23 years of separation had been built on lies and financial threats. "Tell me about her," David said finally. "Tell me about your life." So Sophia did. She told him about growing up in a series of small apartments while Catherine worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. About the way her mother had taught her to find beauty in thrift store finds and library books, to measure wealth in laughter and adventure rather than bank balances. About Catherine's marriage to Marcus when Sophia was 14, and how it had provided financial security at the cost of emotional safety. She told him about 8 years of walking on eggshells, of being grateful for scraps of acceptance while never quite belonging anywhere. About the dining room conversation that had ended with her exile, and the discovery of documents that had led her to his door. David listened without interrupting, his expression cycling through anger, sorrow, and something that might have been pride when she described her decision to drive to Seattle rather than accept Marcus's arrangements. "You're remarkable," he said when she finished.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Your mother raised an extraordinary person. I don't feel extraordinary. I feel lost. Lost people find the most interesting places, David replied with a slight smile that transformed his entire face. Sometimes getting lost is the only way to discover where you actually belong. He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly, the first physical contact she'd had with a blood relative since her mother's death. His fingers were warm and calloused, marked by years of building things that mattered. "I have something to show you," he said, standing and walking to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room. He returned with a manila folder that he placed on the table between them. Inside were architectural sketches, dozens of them, all depicting the same subject. A house, drawn from multiple angles and in various stages of detail. Not a mansion like Marcus's estate, but something smaller and more thoughtful.
A craftsman-style home with wide front porches and built-in bookshelves, gardens visible through large windows, spaces designed for actual living rather than impressive display. "I've been designing this house for 20 years, David said, his voice quiet. "Every time I finished a project that made me proud, every time I received recognition for my work, I'd come home and add another detail to these plans. It was meant to be the house I'd build for the family I thought I'd lost." Sophia studied the drawings, noting the careful attention to detail, the way every room seemed designed to encourage connection and conversation. It was the kind of house her mother had dreamed about during their apartment years, when they'd walk through nice neighborhoods and imagine what it would be like to have space for a real garden and friends for dinner. "The third bedroom," she noticed, pointing to one of the floor plans. "It has built-in desk space and bookshelves. For a daughter who might like to read and study somewhere quiet." The simplicity of it, the way he'd been planning for her existence without knowing if she'd ever materialize, broke something open in Sophia's chest. She'd spent years trying to earn a place in Marcus's family, and here was a man who'd been saving space for her since before she was born. "I've been looking for you," David continued. "Not actively at first, because I believed what your grandfather told me about Catherine not wanting contact. But in recent years, as I built the business and gained some financial security, I started wondering. I hired investigators, but Bennett is a common name, and I didn't know Catherine had married." He pulled another document from the folder, and Sophia recognized it as a copy of the will update he'd made 6 months earlier, the one that had mentioned provisions for biological children he might have fathered. "My lawyer thought I was being overly optimistic," David said with a rueful smile. "But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, that maybe I had family I'd never met." "What happens now?" Sophia asked, overwhelmed by the day's revelations and the strange experience of sitting across from someone who shared her genetic material and seemed genuinely happy to discover her existence. "Now, if you're willing, we get to know each other. We figure out what kind of relationship we want to build, and in the immediate term, we solve your housing situation." "I can't just move in with you. We barely know each other." "Of course not. But I own several properties around the city, including a small apartment above the bakery down the street that's been vacant for months. It's furnished, the rent is reasonable, and it would give you time to find your footing while we navigate the situation." The offer was generous beyond anything Sophia had dared hope for, but it also felt too easy. A lifetime of Marcus's conditional support had taught her to be suspicious of gifts that came without obvious strings attached. "Why would you do that? You don't know anything about me except what I've told you in the last hour." David was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because 23 years ago, I let someone convince me that I wasn't good enough for your mother or worthy of being your father. I've spent 2 decades building a life I'm proud of, partly to prove them wrong. If you're willing to give me the chance, I'd like to try being the father I should have been all along." The afternoon dissolved into logistics and conversation. David called his property manager to arrange access to the apartment, then took Sophia to lunch at a small cafe near the office, where the owner knew him by name and brought extra bread without being asked. They talked about her college experience, his journey from small-town architect to successful business owner, and the peculiar experience of discovering that you have fundamental traits in common with someone you've just met. "You do that thing with your hands when you're thinking," David observed, as Sophia absently sketched patterns on her napkin while processing everything he told her. "What thing?" "You move them like you're building something in the air. I do the same thing during client meetings when I'm trying to visualize solutions." It was a small thing, but it felt significant, evidence that she came from somewhere, that her quirks and habits weren't random accidents, but inherited traits passed down through generations. The apartment above Rossetti's bakery was small but charming, with exposed brick walls and windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street where people walked dogs and carried coffee cups from the shop below. Mrs. Rossetti included breakfast pastries in the rent, David explained, as the elderly Italian woman who owned the bakery insisted on showing Sophia how to work the temperamental apartment door. "You're too thin," Mrs. Rossetti declared, studying Sophia with the critical eye of someone who'd been feeding people for decades. "Tomorrow morning, you come down for coffee and I'll make you something proper." It wasn't a request. That evening, as Sophia unpacked her boxes in the apartment that felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived since childhood, she called Mrs. Chen as promised. The housekeeper answered on the second ring, her voice warm with relief. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. How was the drive?" Long but worth it, Sophia said, settling into the reading chair with a cup of tea. I found him, Mrs. Chen. I found my father. And? And he's nothing like Marcus. He's been looking for me too. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, and Sophia could picture her in the kitchen at Willowbrook Manor, probably preparing tomorrow's meals while Marcus and Trevor remained oblivious to the effort required to maintain their comfortable lifestyle. Your mother would be so happy, Mrs. Chen said finally. She always worried about what would happen to you after she was gone. How are things there? Mr. Trevor asked about you yesterday. He seemed surprised that you'd really left. And Marcus? He converted your room into a gym, just like Trevor warned you. But he's been asking questions about your mother's papers, whether she kept important documents in her study. The comment sent a chill through Sophia's contentment. Marcus was methodical about protecting his interests, and the fact that he was suddenly concerned about Catherine's paperwork suggested he might have discovered something troubling. What kind of questions? About lawyers, about whether she'd made any changes to her will before she died. I think he found out about the private investigator. This was potentially problematic.
If Marcus realized that Catherine had been actively searching for David, he might piece together Sophia's real destination and decide that her existence posed some kind of threat to his interests. She wasn't sure what leverage he might have, but she'd learned not to underestimate his ability to create problems for people who inconvenienced him. Mrs. Chen, be careful what you tell him. And if anyone else starts asking questions about my mother's papers or where I might have gone, you don't know anything. Of course, dear. But Sophia, you should know that your mother left more than just that one envelope. There's a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown. The key is taped under the bottom drawer of her jewelry box. After they hung up, Sophia sat in the growing darkness of her new apartment, processing this latest revelation. Her mother had been more prepared than anyone realized, building layers of protection and information that extended beyond what she'd hidden in her study. Tomorrow, she would need to figure out how to access a safety deposit box in another state, what other secrets Catherine might have preserved, and whether Marcus's sudden interest in her mother's affairs posed any real danger to her newfound relationship with David. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt safe. She was 3 blocks from a father who seemed genuinely happy to know her, living in a space where she didn't have to earn her right to exist, surrounded by the sounds of a neighborhood where people chose to build their lives. The next morning brought the promised pastries from Mrs. Rossetti and coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Sophia sat at her small kitchen table, watching the street come alive with morning commuters and dog walkers when her phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and she felt the small thrill of recognition that comes with having someone who actually wants to hear from you. "I hope I'm not calling too early," he said. "I wanted to catch you before I get caught up in meetings." "Perfect timing. I'm having breakfast and watching Seattle wake up." "How did you sleep?" It was such a normal question, the kind parents ask their children every day, but it made Sophia's throat tighten with emotion. No one had asked about her sleep quality in years. "Better than I have in months," she answered honestly. "Good. Listen, I have a proposition for you. One of our project managers just gave notice, and we need someone with attention to detail and organizational skills to help coordinate between our design team and construction crews. It's entry-level, but it's real work with growth potential. You don't have to create a job for me. I'm not creating anything. We genuinely need help, and you need employment. The fact that it would give us more time to get to know each other is just a bonus. I don't know anything about architecture or construction. Neither did I when I started, but you can learn and we can teach you. What do you say?" Sophia looked around her small apartment, thinking about the alternative future she'd been offered in Vermont and the difference between charity designed to make you disappear and opportunities meant to help you grow. When do I start? How about Monday? That gives you the weekend to settle in and explore the neighborhood. After David hung up, Sophia called the bank in Millbrook to inquire about accessing her mother's safety deposit box. The process would require proving her identity as Catherine's next of kin and possibly traveling back to complete the paperwork in person. It wasn't something she could accomplish quickly or quietly. But first, she wanted to understand more about David's business and the community he'd built around it.
She spent Saturday morning walking through Capitol Hill, discovering bookstores and coffee shops, art galleries featuring local artists, and community gardens where neighbors grew vegetables together. Everyone seemed to know each other, at least casually. The barista at the coffee shop asked about her weekend plans as if they'd been having conversations for years. The woman walking her dog stopped to introduce herself when she noticed Sophia was new to the neighborhood. It was the kind of place where people chose to invest in connections rather than just consuming services. That afternoon, David picked her up for what he called the unofficial tour of Morrison Architecture's current projects. Their first stop was a small housing development on the south side of the city, where young families were moving into homes designed with shared green space and community gathering areas. The traditional model of suburban development isolates people, David explained as they walked through the complex. Everyone retreats to their private spaces and interacts mainly through social media. We're trying to design environments that encourage actual human connection. The homes were modest but thoughtfully designed, with front porches that faced walking paths rather than parking areas, and common spaces that invited spontaneous interaction. Children played in the central courtyard while their parents sat on benches nearby, conversation flowing easily between people who might never have met in a traditional neighborhood layout. "This is what I want to do with my life," David continued. "Build things that make people's lives better, not just more convenient or more impressive." Their second stop was a renovation project downtown, converting an abandoned department store into affordable studio apartments for artists and musicians. The ground floor would house galleries and performance spaces, creating a cultural hub in a neighborhood that had been struggling with vacancy and economic decline. The city wanted to tear it down, David said as they toured the construction site, but the building had good bones, and the community needed affordable creative space more than it needed another luxury development. Sophia watched him interact with the construction crew, the way he listened to their suggestions and incorporated their expertise into real-time problem-solving. These weren't just employees following orders, they were collaborators, invested in creating something meaningful together. "How did you learn to do this?" she asked as they drove back toward Capitol Hill. "Not just the architecture, but the community building part." David was quiet for several blocks, navigating afternoon traffic while considering his answer. "I spent a lot of years after leaving Millbrook feeling like I didn't belong anywhere," he said finally. "I worked for firms that treated architecture like product development, where success was measured entirely in profit margins and awards from industry publications. The work paid well, but it felt empty. What changed? I realized that feeling disconnected wasn't just my personal problem, it was epidemic. People were living in environments designed to isolate them, working in buildings that ignored human psychological needs, shopping in places that felt more like warehouses than community gathering spaces." He pulled into a parking space near her apartment and turned to face her. "I decided that if I was going to spend my life designing spaces where people live and work, I wanted those spaces to make people feel like they belonged somewhere, like they were part of something larger than their individual concerns. Is that why you've been looking for me? To feel like you belong somewhere?" David smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Partly, but also because I wanted to know if I'd managed to create something worth passing on to the next generation. Not just a business, but a way of thinking about how we build the world we live in." That evening, Sophia sat in her apartment writing in the journal she'd started during the drive west. She tried to capture the strange experience of discovering that she'd inherited more than just DNA from David Morrison. She'd inherited a way of seeing the world that prioritized connection over achievement, community over individual success. It was the opposite of everything Marcus Pemberton valued, and recognizing that felt like finally understanding why she'd never managed to fit into his version of family. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When she opened it, her blood went cold. "Sophia, this is Trevor. Dad knows about your father's business and your mother's investigation. He's planning something. Be careful, and whatever you do, don't come back to Millbrook right now." She stared at the message until the words blurred together, her new sense of safety evaporating like morning mist. Marcus wasn't the kind of man who accepted being outmaneuvered by people he considered beneath his station.
If he'd discovered that she'd found her biological father and that David Morrison was successful enough to provide her with alternatives to his charity, he would view it as a personal affront requiring correction. The question was what form that correction might take and whether there was anything he could do to damage the fragile new relationship she was building with David. Outside her window, the neighborhood settled into evening routines, people walking home from work and gathering in the small restaurants along the main street. It looked peaceful and secure, but Sophia had learned not to trust appearances when it came to feeling safe. She forwarded Trevor's message to David, then turned off her phone and drew the curtains. Tomorrow, she would start her new job and continue building a life in Seattle. But tonight, she would try not to think about what Marcus Pemberton might be planning 2,000 miles away. Some distances weren't far enough to escape the reach of people who were determined to control the narrative about who you were allowed to become. Sunday passed quietly, with David taking her to brunch at a restaurant where the servers seemed to know half the customers by name, and everyone appeared genuinely interested in each other's lives rather than just making polite conversation. It was the kind of place where people lingered over coffee and newspapers, where children were welcome but not catered to, where the pace of life felt deliberately unhurried. "This is what I missed most about small-town life," David said as they shared a plate of blackberry pancakes. "The sense that you're part of a community rather than just consuming services in a place where you happen to live." "Millbrook felt more like a performance than a community," Sophia replied. "Everyone was so concerned with maintaining the right image that actual relationships became secondary." "Is that why your mother married Marcus, for the image?" Sophia considered the question, thinking about the woman who'd raised her and the choices that had shaped both their lives. "I think she married him for security, financial and social. After years of struggling to make ends meet while raising me alone, the stability must have felt like winning the lottery. But I don't think she anticipated the emotional cost." "Regrets?" She never said so directly, but in the last few months before she died, she started talking more about the early years when it was just the two of us, like she was trying to remind herself that we'd been happy before we became part of someone else's idea of family. David nodded, understanding passing between them that didn't require words. They both knew what it felt like to sacrifice authenticity for security, to trade pieces of themselves for acceptance that never quite materialized. "What about you?" Sophia asked. "Do you regret taking her father's money?" "Every day for the first 10 years. Then I stopped regretting it and started using it as motivation to become the kind of person who couldn't be bought off with threats and cash. And now? Now I'm grateful because it led me to build a life I'm proud of, and because if I'd stayed in Millbrook, I probably would have ended up working for someone like Marcus Pemberton instead of learning to think for myself." Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that somehow felt comforting rather than depressing. Sophia dressed carefully for her first day at Morrison Architecture, choosing clothes that felt professional but not pretentious, approachable but competent. The office buzzed with the energy of people who enjoyed their work, conversations flowing between desks about project challenges and creative solutions. David introduced her to the team with obvious pride, presenting her as someone who would be learning the business from the ground up while contributing fresh perspectives to their ongoing projects. "Sophia will be working primarily with Maria on project coordination," he announced during the morning meeting. "She has a strong background in research and organization, plus the advantage of seeing our work with fresh eyes." Maria Santos, the senior project manager, welcomed Sophia with the warmth of someone who remembered what it felt like to be new in a complicated field. She was in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and laugh lines that suggested someone who'd learned to find humor in the inevitable chaos of construction projects. "First rule of architecture," Maria said as she showed Sophia to her desk. "Nothing ever goes according to plan, but somehow everything usually works out better than you expected." Sophia's workspace was near a window that looked out onto the street, with enough room for the computer setup she'd need to track project timelines and coordinate between design teams and construction crews. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was real and necessary, the kind of job where her contributions would actually matter. The morning flew by as Maria walked her through the current project portfolio, explaining how designs moved from initial concept through city approval processes to actual construction. Each project had dozens of moving parts, with architects, engineers, contractors, and city officials all needing to stay informed about changes and progress. "Your job is to be the central nervous system," Maria explained.
You make sure information flows to the right people at the right time so problems get solved before they become crises. What's the most challenging part? Managing personalities. Everyone thinks their piece of the project is the most important, and they're all right. Your job is to help them see how their work fits into the larger picture. During lunch, Sophia sat in the small break room reading through project files when one of the younger architects, a woman named Jessica, joined her at the table. "So, you're David's daughter," Jessica said without preamble. "That must be strange, meeting him as an adult." "How did you know?" "He's been talking about you for years. Well, not you specifically, but the daughter he thought might exist somewhere. When he updated his will to include provisions for biological children, the whole office knew he was hoping you'd turn up eventually." The revelation that David had been open about his search for her felt both touching and overwhelming. She'd grown up believing her father was a secret to be ashamed of, but David had been hoping for her existence loudly enough for his colleagues to know about it. "What's he like as a boss?" Jessica grinned. "Demanding but fair. He cares more about the quality of the work and the impact on communities than he does about deadlines or budgets, which makes him unusual in this industry." "Good unusual or complicated unusual?" "Both. We do better work because he pushes us to think about the human impact of our designs, but we also have to be more creative about funding and timelines because he won't take projects that don't align with his values." The afternoon brought Sophia's first real taste of project coordination chaos when the city inspector showed up unannounced at one of their housing developments and discovered that the electrical contractor had misinterpreted the approved plans. The mistake would require significant rewiring and could delay the project by weeks. Sophia found herself in the middle of a conference call between David, the electrical contractor, the city inspector, and the project foreman, taking notes and tracking action items while trying to understand the technical implications of what everyone was discussing. "Can we schedule a site meeting for tomorrow morning?" David asked. "Sophia, can you coordinate calendars and make sure everyone has the updated plans?" It was a small responsibility, but it felt significant. She was being trusted to manage logistics that actually mattered, to be the person who kept important work moving forward. That evening, she called David from her apartment to debrief about her first day and ask questions about the electrical situation. "You did well today," he said. "Maria was impressed with how quickly you picked up the project management software." "I felt like I was drowning most of the time." "That's normal. Architecture is a complicated field with a steep learning curve, but you have good instincts for seeing how pieces fit together." "Is that genetic?" David laughed. "Probably, but mostly it's evidence that Catherine raised you to think systemically about problems. That's a skill you can't teach." They talked for another hour about the project pipeline, about David's philosophy of sustainable development, and about the strange experience of learning to be related to someone as an adult. It felt like the kind of conversation she'd imagined having with a parent during her teenage years, when she'd felt isolated by her complicated family situation. "David," she said as they were ending the call, "thank you for taking a chance on me, both with the job and with the whole father-daughter thing. Thank you for driving 2,000 miles to find me."
That took more courage than accepting a job offer. After they hung up, Sophia settled into her reading chair with a cup of tea and the stack of architecture books David had loaned her. She was halfway through an essay about community-centered design when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus Pemberton. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but something about Trevor's warning message made her think she should know what Marcus wanted. She answered on the fourth ring. "Sophia." His voice carried the same controlled authority she remembered from 8 years of dinner-table conversations. "I trust you've arrived safely in Seattle. How did you get this number?" "I have resources. We need to talk." "I don't think we have anything to discuss." "Your mother's estate has some complications that affect you, legal matters that require your attention." Sophia felt her stomach drop. What kind of legal matters? "The kind that require discretion and good judgment. Are you familiar with your father's business practices?" The question felt like a trap, but she wasn't sure how to avoid it without seeming evasive. "I know he runs an architectural firm that focuses on community development." "Did you know that he's been under federal investigation for bid rigging and tax evasion?" The words hit like a physical blow. "That's not true." "I'm afraid it is. The investigation has been ongoing for 2 years. Your sudden appearance in his life, claiming to be his biological daughter, has attracted additional scrutiny to his financial arrangements." Marcus paused, letting the implications sink in.
I'm calling because I don't want to see you caught up in legal problems that aren't of your making. There are ways to protect yourself, but they require cooperation. What kind of cooperation? Come home, Sophia. Let me help you distance yourself from this situation before it becomes worse. The offer was delivered with the same tone Marcus had used when explaining why she needed to accept the position in Vermont. Reasonable authority masking manipulation. I'm not coming back to Millbrook. Then you're making a mistake that could affect both of you for years to come. He hung up without waiting for her response, leaving Sophia staring at her phone in the growing darkness of her apartment. The evening that had started with quiet satisfaction about her first day of work had transformed into anxiety about threats she didn't understand. She tried calling David, but it went to voicemail. Then she remembered that he'd mentioned an evening meeting with potential investors for a new affordable housing project. Instead, she found herself researching federal investigation procedures and Morrison Architecture's business practices online, looking for any indication that Marcus's claims might be legitimate. What she found was a company with an outstanding reputation, numerous awards for sustainable design, and financial records that appeared to be publicly available and professionally audited. Either Marcus was lying about the investigation, or David had managed to keep serious legal problems completely hidden from his employees and business partners. Both possibilities felt equally unlikely, which left Sophia sitting in her apartment at midnight, wondering whether she'd traded one form of family manipulation for another, more sophisticated version. The next morning brought answers, but not the kind she'd been hoping for. David was waiting in the office lobby when Sophia arrived the next morning, his expression grim as he gestured for her to follow him to the conference room. The same room where they'd first met just days earlier now felt charged with tension that had nothing to do with their newfound relationship. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind them. "I got some interesting phone calls last night." Sophia's stomach clenched. "About federal investigations?" David's eyebrows shot up. "So you've heard. How?" "Marcus called me. He said you were under investigation for bid rigging and tax evasion, and that my presence here was making things worse." That son of a bitch. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Sophia was beginning to recognize as his way of processing frustration. "Okay, here's what's actually happening. There is no federal investigation of Morrison Architecture, but there was an inquiry started about 6 months ago, based on allegations made by an anonymous tipster." "What kind of allegations?" "That we were submitting artificially low bids for city contracts and making up the difference through illegal side payments. That we were underreporting income to avoid federal taxes. Basic white-collar crime accusations that, if true, would destroy everything I've built." David walked to the window, staring out at the street where morning commuters hurried past with coffee cups and briefcases. "The inquiry took 3 weeks. Federal investigators examined our books, interviewed our employees, reviewed every contract we've signed in the past 5 years. They found nothing because there was nothing to find." "So why did Marcus know about it?" "Because your stepfather was the anonymous tipster." The words hit Sophia like cold water. She sank into one of the conference chairs, trying to process the implications. "How do you know?" "The FBI agent who ran the inquiry called me last night. Apparently, after they closed the case, they kept investigating the source of the false allegations. Financial records show that Marcus Pemberton paid a private investigator $50,000 to compile a dossier on Morrison Architecture, then used that information to file complaints with multiple federal agencies." David turned back to face her, his expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been admiration. "The timing is interesting. The investigation started right around the time your mother hired her private investigator to find me. I think Marcus discovered what Catherine was doing and decided to preemptively destroy any potential relationship between us." "But why? What does he care if I have a relationship with my biological father?" "Control," David said simply. "Men like Marcus Pemberton need to control the narrative about their families. Having you connected to someone he can't intimidate or buy off threatens his authority." Sophia thought about 8 years of walking on eggshells, of carefully managing her behavior to avoid triggering Marcus's displeasure. The idea that he'd spent months orchestrating federal investigations to prevent her from finding family elsewhere felt both shocking and entirely consistent with his character. What happens now? Now we have choices to make. The FBI agent wants to pursue charges against Marcus for filing false reports and conspiracy, but that would mean months of legal proceedings, depositions, media attention. You don't want to press charges? I want to build houses and design communities. I don't want to spend the next year of my life in courtrooms fighting with your stepfather. David paused, studying her face. But this is your decision too. He tried to sabotage our relationship before it even started.
If you want to hold him accountable for that, I'll support you. Sophia sat in silence for several minutes, weighing options that all felt inadequate. Pursuing legal action against Marcus would be satisfying, but would also mean staying connected to his toxicity for months or years. Ignoring his actions would let him escape consequences, but would allow her to focus on building her new life. What would happen to Trevor if his father was charged with federal crimes? I don't know, probably nothing legally, but it would damage the family reputation Marcus works so hard to maintain. Trevor warned me that Marcus was planning something. He's not completely under his father's influence. David nodded slowly. So, what do you want to do? I want to focus on the future instead of fighting about the past, but I also want to make sure Marcus can't do this to anyone else. There might be a third option, David said, pulling out his phone. Let me make a call. An hour later, they were sitting in the downtown office of Patricia Chen, the FBI agent who'd handled the Morrison architecture inquiry. She was a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen enough white-collar crime to recognize patterns. Mr. Pemberton filed similar complaints against 3 other Seattle businesses in the past 2 years, Agent Chen explained, spreading files across her desk. All companies that might have been inconvenient for him in various ways. A construction firm that underbid his company for a Millbrook project, an investment group that refused to partner with his consulting business, and Morrison Architecture. So this is a pattern, Sophia said, a clear pattern of using federal agencies as weapons against personal and business enemies. Which is a serious crime, but one that's difficult to prosecute because the damage is often done before we can prove malicious intent. Agent Chen leaned back in her chair, studying both of them. But in this case, we have something unusual. We have timing that clearly connects Mr. Pemberton's actions to his discovery of your mother's investigation. We have financial records showing payments to the private investigator, and we have phone records showing coordination between the investigator and the anonymous tips filed against Morrison Architecture. What does that mean practically? David asked. It means we can build a strong case for criminal conspiracy and harassment, but it also means we can offer Mr. Pemberton a choice. He can accept responsibility for his actions and agree to certain conditions, or he can face federal charges. What kind of conditions? Public acknowledgement of his false allegations against Morrison Architecture and the other businesses, financial restitution for the costs of defending against his complaints, agreement to cease any further harassment of Miss Bennett or her associates, and submission to federal monitoring of his business practices for the next 5 years. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was accountability without the emotional cost of a prolonged legal battle. More importantly, it would create a public record of Marcus's actions that might protect future victims. How long do we have to decide? Sophia asked. Take the time you need. Mr. Pemberton isn't going anywhere, and we have enough evidence to pursue this case whenever you're ready. That afternoon, Sophia returned to work with a strange sense of clarity. Marcus's attempt to destroy her relationship with David had backfired, providing evidence of his manipulative behavior while strengthening the bond between father and daughter. The federal investigation he'd orchestrated had ultimately proven David's integrity and business practices. She spent the day coordinating schedules and managing project communications, finding comfort in the routine of useful work. Around 4 o'clock, Maria stopped by her desk with a stack of architectural drawings. David wants you to sit in on the community meeting tonight for the Riverside project, Maria said. It's good experience in seeing how we present designs to the people who'll actually live in the spaces we create. The meeting was held in the gymnasium of a local elementary school, with folding chairs arranged in rows facing a presentation area where David and his team had set up architectural models and neighborhood maps. About 50 people attended, mostly families with young children and older residents who'd lived in the area for decades. David began by acknowledging the concerns that had been raised about gentrification and displacement, addressing them directly rather than hiding behind corporate language. "We're not here to transform your neighborhood into something it's not," he said. "We're here to work with you to address the housing shortage while preserving the community characteristics that make this place special." The presentation focused on affordable units integrated seamlessly with market-rate housing, shared community spaces that would serve residents of all income levels, and design elements that reflected the area's cultural diversity. It wasn't about imposing an external vision, but about amplifying what already worked while solving practical problems. During the question period, residents raised concerns about parking, noise during construction, and whether the affordable units would really remain affordable over time. David and his team answered each question with specific details and concrete commitments, treating community concerns as design constraints to be solved rather than obstacles to be overcome. Watching him work, Sophia began to understand why his employees were so loyal and why his projects had such strong community support. He approached architecture as a collaborative process rather than an expert imposing solutions on people who had to live with the consequences. "How do you decide which projects to take on?" an elderly woman asked toward the end of the meeting. "We ask 3 questions," David replied. "Will this project improve people's daily lives? Will it strengthen community connections? And can we do it in a way that respects both the budget and the environment? What if a project would be profitable but doesn't meet those criteria? Then we don't take it. Life's too short to spend it building things that make the world worse." After the meeting, as they packed up the presentation materials, several residents approached to continue conversations about specific design elements. A young mother wanted to discuss playground safety features. A teenager asked about internship opportunities for students interested in architecture. An older man shared stories about the neighborhood's history that might influence landscape design choices. "This is the part I love most," David told Sophia as they loaded the car. "The moment when a design stops being our idea and starts being a community vision." "How often do projects actually turn out the way you envision them?" "Almost never, but they usually turn out better because community input catches problems we wouldn't have anticipated and suggests improvements we wouldn't have thought of." They drove back toward Capitol Hill through neighborhoods that showcased different approaches to urban development. Some areas featured cookie-cutter developments where every house looked identical and public spaces felt like afterthoughts. Others showed evidence of thoughtful planning, with diverse housing options and gathering spaces that encouraged interaction. "The built environment shapes how people relate to each other," David explained as they stopped at a traffic light near a small park where families were playing on playground equipment. "Design choices determine whether neighbors become friends or remain strangers." "Is that why you do this work? To bring people together?" "Partly, but also because I understand what it feels like to be isolated, to live in spaces that don't welcome you or acknowledge your existence." David pulled into a parking space near Sophia's apartment, but neither of them moved to get out of the car. "I've been thinking about Marcus's phone call," he said, "about his claim that you'll never be real family."
Don't let him get in your head. He's been saying things like that to me for 8 years. But here's what he doesn't understand. Family isn't about blood or legal documents or who gets mentioned in wills. It's about choosing to show up for each other, especially when it's difficult. David turned to face her in the growing darkness of the car. "You drove 2,000 miles to find someone you'd never met, based on nothing but hope and documents hidden in a desk drawer. That's not the behavior of someone who doesn't understand family. That's the behavior of someone who's willing to fight for connection." "I was desperate. I didn't have anywhere else to go." Desperation doesn't explain courage. Lots of desperate people accept whatever help they're offered without questioning whether they deserve better. Sophia sat with that observation for a moment, thinking about the version of herself who might have accepted the custodial job in Vermont rather than risk the uncertainty of looking for her biological father. What changed your mind about pressing charges against Marcus? Watching you at the community meeting tonight, seeing how you paid attention to people's concerns, how you asked thoughtful questions about design choices. You have instincts for this work that can't be taught. I don't understand the connection. Marcus tried to prevent you from finding me because he was afraid of losing control over your future. But you're already building something he can't touch. Skills, relationships, a sense of purpose that doesn't depend on his approval.
David paused, choosing his words carefully. The best revenge against people who try to diminish you is to become someone whose success makes their limitations obvious. That night, Sophia called Trevor using the number he'd texted from. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. "I wasn't sure you'd call back. I wanted to thank you for the warning, and to let you know that your father's plan backfired." "How so?" Sophia explained about the FBI investigation, the evidence of Marcus's false allegations, and the options they now had for holding him accountable. Trevor listened without interrupting, and she could hear him processing the implications. So he could go to federal prison if he chooses not to accept responsibility and make restitution. But I think he'll take the deal. What kind of restitution? Public acknowledgement that his allegations were false, financial compensation for the businesses he targeted, agreement to stop harassing me or David. Trevor was quiet for a long moment. "I'm glad," he said finally. "Not about the legal trouble, but about you finding your dad, and about having somewhere to go that isn't connected to our family's dysfunction. How are you doing with all this?" "Honestly, it's been eye-opening. Watching him react to your leaving, seeing how far he was willing to go to maintain control over your life. It's made me question things about my own relationship with him, such as whether the support he's provided me over the years comes with strings I haven't noticed yet, whether his version of family loyalty is actually just another form of control." Sophia understood the discomfort Trevor was experiencing. Recognizing manipulation in retrospect was painful, especially when it came from someone who was supposed to have your best interests at heart. "Have you thought about what you want to do after graduate school?" "I was planning to join his consulting firm, but now I'm wondering if that's what I actually want or just what I've been conditioned to want." "What would you do if you could choose freely?" "I've always been interested in environmental law, corporate responsibility, climate change litigation, the kind of work that might occasionally put me at odds with businesses like Dad's." It was the first time in 8 years that Sophia had heard Trevor express genuine personal interests rather than echoing Marcus's priorities. The transformation was subtle but significant. "There are good environmental law programs on the West Coast," she said carefully, not wanting to push too hard. "I've been looking at some. Berkeley has a clinic that works on sustainable development issues. Stanford has partnerships with renewable energy companies. Both of those are closer to Seattle than Millbrook." Trevor laughed, the first genuine humor she'd heard from him since childhood. "Coincidentally, yes. Although I'm not sure Dad would see it as a coincidence. Sometimes the best family decisions are the ones that disappoint your parents." After they hung up, Sophia realized that Marcus's attempts to isolate her had inadvertently freed both his children from his expectations. Trevor was questioning his predetermined career path, and she was building a life that didn't require his approval. The next few weeks fell into a routine that felt both new and familiar. Sophia arrived at the office each morning to find her desk organized with project updates and scheduling requests from Maria. She spent her days coordinating between design teams and construction crews, learning to anticipate problems before they became crises. The work was challenging but satisfying in ways that her college classes had never been. Instead of studying theoretical frameworks, she was helping to solve real problems that affected people's daily lives. When she successfully coordinated a design change that allowed a housing project to include more accessible units, the impact was immediate and measurable. David began including her in client meetings and community presentations, not as an observer, but as someone whose input was valued. She discovered that her years of navigating Marcus's household politics had given her skills in reading group dynamics and finding compromise solutions that worked for multiple stakeholders. "You have a gift for seeing what people actually need rather than what they say they want," David observed after a particularly successful community meeting. "That's rare in this field. I had good training in translating between what people said and what they meant. Those skills transfer well to architecture. Buildings have to work for people's real behaviors, not their idealized versions of how they think they should live." On a Friday afternoon in late spring, David knocked on Sophia's desk while she was reviewing contractor bids for a new affordable housing project. "Do you have time for a walk? There's something I want to show you." They drove to a hillside neighborhood about 20 minutes from downtown, where houses sat on large lots with views of the water and mountains. David parked in front of a craftsman-style home with a wide front porch and mature trees that provided privacy without blocking natural light. "This is beautiful," Sophia said as they walked up the front path. "Is it one of your projects?"
In a way, I bought this lot 15 years ago and designed the house myself. It's where I've been living while I figured out what I really wanted to build. The interior was warm and inviting, with built-in bookshelves, hardwood floors that showed gentle wear, and windows that framed views of the garden rather than neighboring houses. It felt like a home where people actually lived rather than a showplace designed to impress visitors. But here's what I really wanted to show you, David said, leading her to a room that had been set up as a design studio.
The walls were covered with architectural drawings, some framed and others tacked up with pushpins. A drafting table sat near the window, surrounded by shelves of reference books and design materials. In the center of the room was a large table holding a detailed architectural model of a house that looked familiar. This is the house from your sketches, Sophia realized, the one you've been designing for 20 years. The one I've been designing for the family I hoped I might find someday, David corrected. But I realized something while I was watching you learn this business. I don't want to build this house for some theoretical future family. I want to build it for us, for the relationship we're actually creating. Sophia studied the model, noting details that had been refined since the sketches she'd seen weeks earlier. The kitchen was larger, with space for multiple people to cook together. The living areas flowed more naturally, designed for conversation rather than formal entertaining. The study included built-in desk space for 2 people. You want us to live together? I want us to build something together, not just a house, but a home base for whatever comes next in both our lives. David walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where he'd been living alone for 15 years. I've been thinking about what you said about family being something you choose rather than something you inherit. I choose you, Sophia. I choose to be your father, not just biologically, but practically. I want to show up for your life in ways that matter. What about your business, your life here? Morrison Architecture isn't going anywhere, but I'm 47 years old, and I've spent the last decade building a successful company while living in a house designed for one person. I'm ready for the next chapter. Sophia felt tears threatening as she looked around the studio where David had been designing spaces for a family that might never materialize. The room felt like a shrine to hope, evidence of someone who'd refused to accept that isolation was permanent. Where would we build it? I own 20 acres about an hour north of the city, wooded with a creek running through it, close enough to commute to the office but far enough away to feel private. You've been planning this for a long time. I've been hoping for this for 23 years. That evening, they sat on David's back porch with takeout from the Thai restaurant down the street, talking about practical details and impossible dreams. What it would mean to design a house together, to create spaces that reflected both their needs and personalities, how they would navigate the daily realities of becoming a family as adults. There's something else, David said as they finished eating, something I've been waiting for the right moment to discuss. He disappeared into the house and returned with a manila folder that he placed on the table between them. I updated my will last week. Everything goes to you. The business, the properties, the investments, all of it. Sophia stared at the documents without touching them. David, we've known each other for 6 weeks. I've been looking for you for 23 years, and in the past 6 weeks, you've shown me more about who you are than most people reveal in decades. But what if this doesn't work out? What if we discover we can't actually live together? Then we'll figure out how to be family from a distance. But the inheritance doesn't depend on our living arrangements. It depends on the fact that you're my daughter, and I want you to have something to build on. David leaned forward, his expression serious. Marcus Pemberton told you that you'd never be real family. But family isn't about blood or legal documents. It's about commitment and choice and showing up when it matters. So why does the will matter? Because legal documents have power in the world. Because I want to make sure that if something happens to me, you'll have resources to continue building the life you want. Because I refuse to let your financial security depend on someone else's version of charity. Sophia picked up the will and read through the formal language that designated her as David's primary beneficiary. It felt surreal to see her name in legal documents that promised security rather than threatening exile. There's one condition, David added. If you inherit the business, you have to promise to keep building things that make people's lives better.
I don't care if you run it yourself or hire other people to do it, but Morrison architecture has to remain community-centered design. That's not a condition, that's just good business practice. Then we're in agreement. They sat in comfortable silence as the evening light faded and the neighborhood settled into dinner routines. Sophia could hear children playing in nearby yards, the sound of laughter and conversation drifting over fences. It was the kind of evening she'd imagined during her childhood in small apartments, when she dreamed about what it would feel like to belong somewhere. "When do you want to start planning the house?" she asked. "Whenever you're ready. But first, I think we should deal with Marcus." Agent Chen had called that afternoon with news that Marcus had agreed to the federal monitoring deal rather than face criminal charges. He would be required to publish acknowledgments of his false allegations in both the Millbrook newspaper and the Seattle Business Journal, pay restitution to the companies he'd targeted, and submit to federal oversight of his business practices for 5 years. How did he react to the terms? According to Agent Chen, he was furious but compliant. His lawyer apparently convinced him that federal prison was worse for his reputation than public admission of misconduct. "Do you think he'll leave us alone now?" "I think he'll be too busy dealing with the consequences of his actions to worry about what we're doing. And I think the federal monitoring will keep him from targeting anyone else." The next morning brought a phone call from Trevor, his voice excited in a way Sophia hadn't heard since they were children. "I got into Berkeley," he said without preamble, "full fellowship for the environmental law program." "Trevor, that's amazing! When do you start?" "Fall semester, which means I need to move to California this summer." How did Marcus react? About as well as you'd expect. Lots of discussion about family loyalty and wasted opportunities. But I think seeing the federal investigation unfold made him realize he's not in a position to make demands right now. "Are you nervous about being on your own?" "Terrified, but also excited."
For the first time in my life, I'm making decisions based on what I want rather than what's expected of me. After they hung up, Sophia realized that Marcus's attempts to control his family had ultimately freed all of them from his expectations. Trevor was pursuing law school on the West Coast. She was building a career and relationship in Seattle. Even Mrs. Chen had called to say she was considering retiring early to spend time with her grandchildren. The federal investigation that was supposed to destroy David's business had instead exposed Marcus's manipulation and given his targets the evidence they needed to hold him accountable. His plan to isolate Sophia from potential family connections had resulted in her finding not just a father, but an entire community of people who valued her contributions. 2 months later, Sophia stood in a meadow surrounded by old-growth trees, watching David pace off the dimensions of rooms that existed only in blueprints. The architect who designed houses for other people's families was finally building one for his own. "Kitchen here," he called, marking corners with small flags. "Living room facing south for afternoon light. Study with built-in shelves for both our bucks." She followed behind him, trying to envision walls and windows in the empty space. It was harder than she'd expected to translate drawings into 3-dimensional reality, but David seemed to see the finished house as clearly as if it already existed. "What about the garden?" she asked, pointing to an area that had been marked for landscaping. "That's your department. I can design the irrigation system, but you'll need to choose what to plant. I don't know anything about gardening." "Neither did I when I started this business, but I learned because it mattered to me." They spent the afternoon walking the property, identifying views to preserve and areas that would work best for different outdoor activities. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary would be visible from the kitchen and dining areas. A flat space near the house would accommodate a vegetable garden and maybe space for outdoor dinners. "It feels like playing house," Sophia said as they sat on a fallen log, sharing sandwiches Mrs. Rossetti had packed for their site visit. "It feels like coming home," David replied. That evening, they attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Riverside Housing Project, the community development that had been in planning when Sophia first arrived in Seattle. The affordable units were fully occupied, integrated seamlessly with market-rate housing in a way that made economic diversity feel natural rather than engineered. During the celebration, residents gave speeches about what the new housing meant for their families. A single mother talked about finally having enough space for her children to do homework without distractions. An elderly couple described the relief of living somewhere they could afford without sacrificing safety or community connections.
"This is why we do this work," David said, as they watched children play in the central courtyard while their parents socialized nearby. "Not to win design awards, but to solve problems that actually matter to people." Sophia thought about the conversation they'd had weeks earlier about choosing projects based on community impact rather than profit potential. The Riverside development would never make Morrison Architecture rich, but it was creating wealth in other forms: social connections, housing stability, economic diversity. What's next for the company? "There's a waiting list of communities that want similar developments. We could stay busy for decades just meeting the demand for affordable housing designed with actual families in mind. And you want me to be part of that? I want you to help shape it. You have instincts for seeing what people need and skills for coordinating complex projects. But more than that, you understand what it feels like to be excluded from spaces that should welcome you." As they drove home through neighborhoods that showcased different approaches to urban development, Sophia realized that she'd found more than just a father in Seattle. She'd found a purpose that aligned with her values and a community that respected her contributions. 6 months after arriving in the city with nothing but a suitcase and her mother's hidden documents, she was coordinating million-dollar construction projects and helping to design housing that would serve families for generations. But the real transformation was more personal. She'd stopped apologizing for taking up space or asking permission to exist in rooms that were meant for her. The girl who'd spent 8 years trying to earn approval from Marcus Pemberton had been replaced by a woman who understood that belonging was something you claimed rather than something you waited to be granted. The will reading happened on a Tuesday morning in December, almost a year after Sophia had left Millbrook with a broken arm and a single dollar. She sat in the conference room of David's lawyer's office, watching snow fall outside the windows while the attorney read through the formal language that would transfer Morrison Architecture and all associated assets to her upon David's death. "This is morbid," she said during a break in the proceedings. "You're only 48. Hopefully this won't be relevant for decades." "Hopefully not, but I wanted the legal framework in place before we break ground on the house." "Because you don't trust me to honor your wishes without written documentation?" "Because I want to make sure no one can challenge your right to continue the work we're building together." David's lawyer, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, smiled as she organized the final documents. "Mr. Morrison has been updating his estate planning for months," she said. "Usually people wait until they're facing health crises to think about inheritance. It's refreshing to work with someone who's planning for continuity rather than crisis." "What does this mean practically?" Sophia asked. "It means that if something happened to David tomorrow, you would own one of the most respected architectural firms in the Pacific Northwest, along with significant real estate holdings and investment assets." The lawyer paused, studying Sophia with professional assessment. "It also means that you'd be responsible for the livelihoods of 15 employees and the completion of ongoing projects that serve dozens of communities." "That's terrifying." "That's leadership," David corrected, "and you're already doing it. The difference is that now you'd have the legal authority to make decisions instead of just implementing other people's choices." After the meeting, they walked through downtown Seattle in the falling snow, past coffee shops and bookstores that had become familiar parts of Sophia's routine. The city felt like home now in ways that Millbrook never had, even after 8 years of trying to belong there. "Do you ever miss anything about your old life?" David asked as they stopped to look at holiday decorations in a gallery window. "I miss my mother. I miss Mrs. Chen. Sometimes I miss the version of Trevor who used to build elaborate snow forts before his father taught him that competition was more important than creativity. But not the house or the lifestyle. I was never part of the lifestyle. I was just someone who happened to live there." They continued walking toward the waterfront, where ferries moved slowly through the gray water and seagulls circled overhead looking for food scraps. The snow was beginning to accumulate on sidewalks and benches, transforming the familiar landscape into something softer and more magical. "I got a letter from Marcus yesterday," Sophia said. "And?" "He's selling the house. Apparently, the federal monitoring and public acknowledgement of his false allegations has damaged his consulting business, that he needs to downsize. How do you feel about that?" "Relief, mostly. It means I won't be tempted to drive by when I'm visiting my mother's grave. The house will become someone else's problem." David nodded, understanding the complex emotions involved in watching places from your past transform or disappear. "Where is he moving?" Trevor didn't say, but he mentioned that Marcus is considering early retirement.
spending more time on golf and less time on business development. Forced retirement by federal oversight is different from chosen retirement. True, but maybe it's also an opportunity for him to discover who he is when he's not focused on controlling other people's choices. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow continue to fall and the ferries navigate between distant islands. Sophia thought about the journey that had brought her from Millbrook to this bench, from exile to inheritance, from searching for belonging to creating it. "David," she said finally, "thank you for choosing me. Thank you for finding me." The house construction began in spring, with Sophia splitting her time between managing Morrison architecture projects and learning about foundation engineering, sustainable building materials, and the hundred small decisions involved in creating a home from scratch. She discovered that she loved the problem-solving aspects of construction, the way each challenge required creative solutions that balanced function, aesthetics, and budget constraints. When the original plans for the kitchen had to be modified because of unexpected rock formations, she worked with the contractor to design a better layout that took advantage of the natural landscape. "You have instincts for this," the contractor told her as they reviewed updated blueprints. "Most homeowners panic when plans change. You see it as an opportunity to improve the design." "I learned to adapt to changing circumstances pretty early in life." "Well, it's serving you well here. This kitchen is going to be beautiful and functional in ways the original design wouldn't have been." By summer, the frame was complete and they could walk through rooms that had existed only in drawings for 2 decades. Sophia stood in what would become her study, looking out windows that framed views of the creek and surrounding forest. "It feels bigger than I expected," she said as David joined her near the built-in desk that would hold her computer and project files. "Most spaces do once you can actually move through them instead of just looking at drawings." "No, I mean it feels bigger in terms of possibility, like there's room for things we haven't thought of yet." David smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. The house they were building was designed to accommodate not just their current needs, but their potential growth as individuals and as a family. That's intentional. Good architecture creates space for life to happen rather than trying to control how life should happen. They moved in during October, carrying boxes up the front steps of a house that had been 23 years in the making. Sophia's bedroom faced east, with windows that would fill the space with morning light. David's faced west, designed to catch afternoon and evening sun. The kitchen sat at the heart of the house, with views of both the garden and the living areas. "Home," David said as they stood in the empty living room, surrounded by boxes and possibilities. "Home," Sophia agreed. That night, they ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the floor in front of the fireplace, planning where furniture would go and what they wanted to plant in the spring garden. It felt like a celebration and a beginning, the end of one chapter and the opening of another. The next morning brought a call from Agent Chen with news that Marcus's federal monitoring had uncovered additional evidence of fraudulent business practices. He would likely face additional charges related to tax evasion and client fraud. "How do you feel about that?" David asked after Sophia relayed the information. "Like justice is finally catching up with him, but also sad for Trevor, who has to watch his father's reputation collapse in public." "How is Trevor handling it?" "Better than I expected. His law school program includes a clinic that works on white-collar crime prosecution. He's thinking about specializing in cases involving corporate fraud and abuse of power." Interesting career choice for Marcus Pemberton's son. Interesting but not surprising. Trevor's always been smart. Now he's applying that intelligence to work that matters instead of just perpetuating his father's approach to business. 2 weeks later, Trevor called with news that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. "I'm coming to Seattle for Thanksgiving," he said, "if you'll have me." "Of course, but why Seattle instead of Millbrook?" "Because Dad's been arrested. Federal charges related to the monitoring investigation. His lawyer says he'll probably take a plea deal, but it means he'll likely serve some prison time." Sophia felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Marcus had finally faced consequences for his behavior, but it meant Trevor was losing the only family he'd known. "I'm sorry, Trevor. I know this is complicated for you." "It's actually liberating in a strange way. For the first time in my life, I don't have to consider what he wants when I make decisions."
Trevor arrived the week as Thanksgiving, carrying a duffel bag and a tentative hope that he might be welcome in the family Sophia was building with David. They spent the holiday preparing a meal together in the kitchen that had been designed for exactly this kind of gathering. "This feels like what I always thought family dinners should be like," Trevor said, as they sat around the table David had built from wood salvaged from the construction site. "How so?" "People actually talking to each other instead of performing their roles. Conversations about things that matter instead of just social obligations." "You're welcome here anytime," David said. "This house was designed to accommodate family in all its forms." After Trevor returned to California, Sophia and David settled into the rhythms of living together as adults who'd chosen to become family. They discovered that they both liked coffee strong and conversations slow in the mornings, that they could work on separate projects in the same room without feeling compelled to entertain each other, that they shared a preference for books over television and cooking over restaurants. "It's easier than I expected," Sophia said one evening as they worked side by side in the study, she on construction schedules and he on design proposals for a new community center. "What is?" "Being family. I spent so many years thinking it required constantly proving your worth or managing other people's emotions." "That's not family, that's performance." "What's the difference?" David looked up from his drawings, considering the question seriously. "Family means being accepted for who you are, rather than who you might become with sufficient improvement. It means having people who show up when you need them, not because they have to, but because they choose to. Like driving 2,000 miles to find someone you've never met? Like building a house with space for daughters you've never found yet." Spring brought the groundbreaking ceremony for Morrison Architecture's largest project yet, a mixed-use development that would provide affordable housing, commercial space, and community facilities for a neighborhood that had been struggling with economic decline. Sophia had coordinated the planning process, managing relationships between city officials, community groups, and construction teams. "6 months ago, I was serving dinner to my stepbrother and apologizing for taking up space," she said as they watched the mayor break ground with a ceremonial shovel. "Now I'm managing million-dollar construction projects." "6 months ago, you were already capable of managing million-dollar construction projects. You just hadn't been given the opportunity." "Do you think I would have found this work if I hadn't been forced to leave Millbrook?" "I think you would have found some version of it eventually. You have instincts for seeing what people need and skills for bringing people together to solve problems. That translates to a lot of different fields." "But would I have found you?"
David was quiet for a moment, watching construction crews prepare the site for foundation work. "I like to think we would have found each other eventually. Your mother was looking, I was looking. Sometimes the universe conspires to help people find where they belong." That afternoon, Sophia received a call from Mrs. Chen with news that would close another chapter of her past. "The house sold," the housekeeper said. "The new owners are a young family with 3 children. They seem lovely." "What about Marcus's things, his furniture and art collection?" "Most of it went to auction. He kept very little for wherever he's living now." "And my mother's things?" "I saved what I could. There are boxes in storage with her books, photographs, and some of the jewelry he didn't sell. The new owners said I could arrange for you to pick them up whenever you're ready." A month later, Sophia made her first trip back to Millbrook since leaving with a broken arm and $1 in her pocket. The town looked smaller than she remembered, with the same carefully maintained facades hiding the same social hierarchies she'd never quite navigated successfully. The storage unit contained 4 boxes of her mother's belongings, items that Marcus had apparently considered too sentimental to have monetary value. Photo albums from before his marriage to Catherine, books with inscriptions from friends and colleagues, the small porcelain figurines her mother had collected during their apartment years, when beauty had to be affordable to be attainable. At the bottom of the last box, wrapped in one of Catherine's silk scarves, Sophia found something that made her gasp. A small wooden jewelry box she remembered from childhood, with a note taped to the lid in her mother's handwriting. "For Sophia's daughter, when she's old enough to understand that love isn't about blood, but about choosing to show up for each other's lives." Inside the box was Catherine's engagement ring from her first marriage, the one she'd worn before meeting Marcus. A simple gold band with a small diamond that caught light like captured starlight.
Underneath the ring was a letter, written in Catherine's careful script and dated just weeks before her death. The letter explained everything Catherine had been too afraid to say while she was alive. How she'd always regretted not fighting harder to find David. How she'd hoped Sophia would be braver about pursuing the family connections she deserved. How the private investigator had been hired not just to find David, but to provide Sophia with the information she'd need to find him herself when the time was right. "I should have told you about the safety deposit box," the letter concluded, "but I was afraid Marcus would find out and destroy everything before you had a chance to use it. Mrs. Chen has the key. She knows what to do with it when you're ready." Sophia sat in the storage unit reading her mother's words, finally understanding that Catherine had been orchestrating her escape long before the cancer diagnosis. The hidden documents, the safety deposit box, even the timing of the private investigator's report had all been designed to give Sophia options when Marcus inevitably revealed his true feelings about her place in his family. The safety deposit box contained copies of all the documents hidden in Catherine's study, plus additional evidence of Marcus's threats against David 23 years earlier. Bank records, correspondence, even a recording Catherine had made of one of her father's conversations about paying David to disappear. But it also contained something else: the deed to a small cottage Catherine had inherited from her grandmother, located on 5 acres outside Millbrook. Property that Marcus had apparently never known about, that Catherine had kept in her maiden name and paid taxes on secretly for 15 years. "She left you land," the bank manager explained as Sophia reviewed the documents. "Free and clear, with no mortgages or liens. It's been vacant for years, but the structure is sound." Sophia drove to the property before leaving Millbrook, curious about this final gift from her mother. The cottage was smaller than the apartments they'd shared during her childhood, but it sat on a hill overlooking farmland and forest, with views that stretched for miles in every direction. It felt like a place where someone could start over, where the past couldn't reach you if you didn't invite it in. That evening, she called David from her hotel room to tell him about the cottage and her mother's final letters. "So, what are you thinking?" he asked after she'd described the property and explained about the deed. "I'm thinking my mother spent 15 years planning for my freedom without ever telling me about it. And now? Now I have choices I didn't even know existed. I could sell the cottage and use the money for our house. I could rent it out as passive income. I could turn it into a retreat space for people who need somewhere to heal. Or I could give it to Trevor, a place to come home to that isn't connected to his father's legacy." David was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "That's generous, but are you sure you want to give away property your mother meant for you? I think she meant it for family, and Trevor's family now, in the way that matters." A year and a half after leaving Millbrook in exile, Sophia returned for Trevor's law school graduation. He'd finished his program early, accepting a position with a nonprofit organization that specialized in prosecuting white-collar crime and corporate fraud. "I'm going to spend my career going after people like Dad," he said as they toured the cottage that was now legally his. "People who use money and power to avoid consequences for their actions. How does that feel? Like justice, and like healing." They stood on the cottage porch, looking out at views that stretched towards mountains in the distance. It was peaceful in a way that Willowbrook Manor had never been, despite all its luxury and careful landscaping. "Thank you for this," Trevor said. "For the cottage, but also for showing me what family could look like when it's not based on control and performance. You would have figured it out eventually. Maybe, but having an example helped." That fall, Morrison Architecture won a national award for community-centered design, recognizing their approach to affordable housing that prioritized social connection over aesthetic uniformity. Sophia accepted the award on behalf of the firm, standing at a podium in front of hundreds of architects and urban planners. "Good design isn't about imposing our vision on communities," she said in her acceptance speech. "It's about listening to what people need and creating spaces that support their actual lives rather than our assumptions about how they should live." In the audience, David watched his daughter address a crowd of industry professionals with the confidence of someone who understood that belonging was something you claimed rather than something you waited to be granted. After the ceremony, they walked through the convention center where examples of award-winning projects were displayed. Photos of their housing developments showed children playing in community gardens, families gathering in shared spaces, neighborhoods that had been transformed from isolated developments into connected communities. 5 years ago, I was designing buildings for other people's ideas of family, David said as they stopped in front of a display showcasing their latest project. Now I'm building communities with my daughter, who understands what it means to create spaces where people can belong. 5 years ago, I was trying to earn acceptance from people who never intended to offer it, Sophia replied. Now I'm designing my own definition of success. 2 years later, Sophia stood in a lawyer's office in downtown Seattle, signing documents that would transfer full ownership of Morrison Architecture to her name. David wasn't dying or retiring. He was choosing to step back from day-to-day management while remaining involved in project design and community outreach. "You've been running the business for months already," he said as they completed the paperwork. "This just makes it official. Are you sure about this? We could structure it as a partnership." "I'm sure."
This company needs to be yours, built around your vision of what architecture can accomplish. The transfer happened on a Thursday in March, with spring rain pattering against the office windows and the city coming alive with the promise of longer days and warmer weather. Sophia signed her name to documents that made her the owner of 15 employees' livelihoods and dozens of ongoing projects that would shape communities for generations. "How does it feel?" the lawyer asked as they completed the final signatures. "Terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. That's how most entrepreneurs feel on their best days." That evening, the Morrison Architecture team gathered at a restaurant near the office to celebrate the ownership transfer and Sophia's new role as company president. She looked around the table at people who'd become more than just colleagues, who'd taught her everything from construction scheduling to community engagement to the art of seeing buildings as platforms for human connection. "When I started working here 2 years ago, I thought I was just learning a job," she said during the informal toasts that followed dinner. "What I actually learned was how to build the kind of life I want to live." "And what kind of life is that?" Maria asked. "One where the work I do makes other people's lives better, where I get to solve problems that actually matter, where I'm surrounded by people who choose collaboration over competition. Where you get to prove wrong everyone who ever said you didn't belong," David added with a smile. "Where I get to define belonging for myself instead of accepting other people's definitions." 6 months later, Sophia received a letter forwarded from her old address in Millbrook. The return address showed it came from a federal prison in Pennsylvania, and the handwriting belonged to Marcus Pemberton. She almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won over caution. The letter was brief and stilted, clearly written by someone unaccustomed to apologizing for anything. "Sophia, I have had time to reflect on my actions and their consequences. My attempts to control your future were wrong and caused unnecessary harm. You have built a successful life without my approval or assistance, which proves my judgment of your capabilities was flawed. I do not expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I recognize my mistakes. Marcus." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that his version of family had been toxic and his treatment of her had been unjustified. Sophia read the letter twice, then filed it away with other documents from her past that she kept for historical reference rather than emotional significance. That night, she called Trevor to tell him about the letter. "How do you feel about it?" Like closure, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement that his narrative was wrong. "Are you going to write back?" "No, there's nothing I need to say to him that would make either of our lives better." "Good. Some conversations aren't worth having." The cottage Trevor had inherited became a regular gathering place for the family they'd chosen to create together. Thanksgiving dinners where everyone contributed something homemade, summer weekends when friends from Seattle would drive out to swim in the pond and cook meals on the outdoor grill David had built from salvaged materials. Mrs. Chen visited twice a year, usually staying for a week at a time and treating the cottage like the retreat center Sophia had originally envisioned.
She'd retired from housekeeping and spent her time reading, gardening, and sharing stories about the years she'd spent taking care of other people's families while raising her own grandchildren. "You found your place," she said during one visit, sitting on the cottage porch while Sophia worked in the garden. "Your mother would be proud. I think she'd be surprised by how far I traveled to find it. She'd be proud that you had the courage to travel as far as necessary." On a Saturday morning in late summer, Sophia stood in the garden behind the house she'd built with David, picking tomatoes and planning the week's meals. The work was simple but satisfying, growing food with her own hands in soil that belonged to her. Inside the house, David was making coffee and reading architectural journals, preparing for the design workshop they were teaching together at the university. Outside, the creek ran steadily toward the larger river that would carry its water eventually to the ocean. It was the kind of morning her mother had dreamed about during their apartment years, when stability felt like something that happened to other people. Sophia's phone rang as she carried the tomatoes toward the kitchen. The caller ID showed Morrison Architecture's main number, which meant Maria was calling about one of their Monday morning project meetings. "Sophia, I'm sorry to bother you on the weekend, but we just got a call about the Riverside expansion project. The city wants to fast-track approval because they have additional funding available." "How fast?" "They want a presentation next Friday. Full design proposal, community impact assessment, construction timeline." It was an ambitious deadline for a complex project, but Sophia had learned to see tight timelines as creative constraints rather than impossible obstacles. "Call a team meeting for Monday morning. I'll start working on the community engagement plan this weekend." "Are you sure? It's a lot of work for a short turnaround." "It's exactly the kind of work I want to be doing." After hanging up, Sophia stood in her kitchen looking out at the garden she'd planted and the forest beyond. 3 years ago, she'd been living in someone else's definition of family, apologizing for existing and trying to earn approval that was never available. Now she was running a company that built homes for people who needed them, living in a house designed for the family she'd chosen, planning projects that would serve communities for generations. Marcus Pemberton had been wrong about everything that mattered. She wasn't just real family, she was the kind of family that created security and opportunity for other people. She'd inherited more than David's business and property. She'd inherited the knowledge that home was something you built rather than something you found ready-made. The girl who'd left Millbrook with a broken arm and a single dollar had become a woman who could fund other people's fresh starts. That afternoon, she drove to Seattle for a site meeting at their newest project, a housing development designed specifically for families transitioning out of homelessness. The buildings were modest but dignified, with private entrances and shared community spaces that encouraged connection without sacrificing independence. Walking through the construction site, Sophia thought about the distance between where she'd started and where she'd ended up, not just geographically, but in terms of understanding what family meant and what home required. Her phone buzzed with a text from David asking if she wanted company for the site visit. She responded that she'd love to have him join her, then stood in the afternoon sunlight waiting for the father who'd been designing space for her in his life since before she was born. Some stories end with people finding where they belong. Others end with people creating belonging for themselves and others. Sophia's story had become the second kind, built on the foundation of her mother's quiet preparation and her own willingness to drive toward uncertainty rather than accept inadequate certainty. When Marcus Pemberton had told her she'd never be real family, he'd meant it as a limitation. What he hadn't understood was that being released from his definition of family would free her to create something better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.